The chandeliers still burned bright in Karen Hall, even as the Reich collapsed around it. Emmy Göring stood alone in the Great Hall on that April morning in 1945, surrounded by masterpieces that did not belong to her, listening to thunder that was not thunder at all. The Soviet artillery had reached Brandenburg. Everyone in the estate knew what that sound meant, but no one dared speak it aloud. To speak of defeat was still treason, even when defeat was marching toward them at 40 kilometers per day. Emmy watched her daughter, Etta, playing on the marble floor with a porcelain doll dressed in Bavarian folk costume. The child was 7 years old. She had been born into silk and servants, raised among stolen Vermeers and plundered Kranichs, taught to curtsy for generals and call mass murderers uncle. She knew nothing else. Emmy wondered, not for the first time, what would become of this innocent girl when the world discovered who her father truly was. The Reichsmarshal himself had built Karen Hall as a monument to his own vanity. Named for his first wife, Karen, the hunting lodge had grown into a palace spanning thousands of square meters, filled with art seized from Jewish families across Europe, from museums in Paris and churches in Poland. Hermann had called them purchases and gifts. Emmy had learned not to ask questions. Wives of powerful men survived by choosing blindness. The young Wehrmacht lieutenant, named Werner Brandt, arrived that morning with orders sealed in red wax. Emmy received him in the drawing room, while servants rushed past carrying crates of silver. Werner was perhaps 25, with the hollow eyes of a man who had seen too much death. He delivered his message with mechanical precision. The Reichsmarshal commanded immediate evacuation. The family would relocate to Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. All essential valuables must be prepared for transport within 6 hours. Emmy nodded and dismissed him, but Werner lingered. He had a second purpose here, one he could not speak aloud. A faction of officers in Berlin had sent him to observe, to document, to ensure that the stolen treasures of Europe did not simply vanish into private hands when the Reich fell. Werner carried a small camera hidden in his coat. He had already photographed the inventory list that hung in the estate office. His conscience had arrived late, but it had arrived. The evacuation proceeded with desperate efficiency. Emmy walked through the halls one final time with her secretary Hilda, a young woman from Hamburg who had served the family for 3 years. Together, they decided which paintings would travel with the convoy and which would remain. A Monet that had once hung in a Parisian banker's home went into the truck. A medieval altarpiece stayed behind. These decisions felt like playing God, Emmy thought, though she lacked the courage to name them as what they truly were. Dividing the evidence of theft, Hilda said nothing. She never said anything. But Emmy had noticed the way the secretary's hands trembled when she handled certain documents, the way her eyes went dark when Jewish names appeared in the provenance records. Hilda knew the truth. Her silence was its own form of complicity, and she knew that too. Etta appeared in the doorway, clutching her doll. "Mama, why are the soldiers taking our paintings? Are we going on holiday?" Emmy knelt and smoothed her daughter's hair. "Yes, darling. A long holiday to the mountains. You will love it there. There is snow, even in spring." The lie came easily. Emmy had been lying to her daughter since birth, lying about where their wealth came from, lying about what Papa did for the Führer, lying about the smoke that rose from certain camps to the east. Lies were the architecture of this family. Without them, everything would collapse. Hermann arrived that evening, bloated and sweating in a uniform that no longer fit properly. He had been taking morphine for years, and his addiction showed in his swollen face and unfocused eyes. Once he had been the dashing, flying ace of the Great War, the glamorous face of the Nazi movement. Now, he was a ruin pretending to be a monument that he gave the final order with casual cruelty. Karen Hall would be destroyed. Engineers had already planted explosives throughout the estate. The Soviets would find nothing but rubble and ash. "Let them see what German pride looked like," he said, even in defeat. Werner watched from the shadows as the convoy departed. Emmy sat rigid in the back seat of a Mercedes, Etta pressed against her side. Behind them, the explosions began. Flame erupted from windows. The roof collapsed. Centuries of art vanished in moments. Etta turned to watch through the rear window. Her porcelain doll clutched her chest. The only home she had ever known was burning, and she did not understand why. She only knew that the world had suddenly become a place where beautiful things could be destroyed in an instant, where fathers gave orders that turned palaces into smoke. The convoy disappeared into the German night, heading south toward mountains that would offer no sanctuary, toward a future that would demand answers for every painting, every chandelier, every lie that had built this burning kingdom. The farmhouse smelled of damp wool and American cigarettes. Emmy Göring had not slept properly in 3 weeks. Not since the soldiers came with their strange English words and their polite but unmistakable authority. She was a prisoner now, though no one used that word. Detained for questioning, they called it. The Americans were civilized about their conquests. They did not rape or burn like the Soviets. They simply asked questions endlessly, while the world she had known crumbled into legal documents and evidence files. May had brought surrender. The Wehrmacht had collapsed. Hitler was dead by his own hand in a Berlin bunker. And Hermann, her husband, the second most powerful man in the Reich, had been captured trying to negotiate with the Americans as if he were still someone who mattered. Emmy learned of his arrest from a young GI who brought her morning coffee. The soldier's name was James Holloway. He was from Ohio. He had a photograph of a girl named Betty in his wallet. He showed it to Etta one afternoon, tried to explain what fiancé meant in German. James had expected monsters when he received this assignment. Instead, he found a frightened woman in faded finery and a little girl who asked him endless questions about America. Was it true that everyone had automobiles? Did children eat ice cream every day? Could she visit Betty someday? James did not know how to reconcile this curious child with the photographs he had seen in the intelligence briefings, the skeletal prisoners and the mass graves and the industrial machinery of murder that her father had helped create. The interrogations began in June. 2 officers from the War Crimes Investigation Team arrived with folders thick as dictionaries. They asked Emmy about the art. Where had it come from? Who had authorized the seizures? Did she know the names of the Jewish families who had been persuaded to sell their collections for fractions of their value before being loaded onto trains heading east? Emmy claimed ignorance. She was only a wife. She knew nothing of her husband's official duties. She had never asked questions. The officers exchanged glances. They had heard this defense before from generals' wives and industrialist daughters and the secretaries of men who had signed execution orders. The women of the Reich had perfected the art of not knowing. But the officers had photographs. They spread them across the farmhouse table like cards in some terrible game. Corpses stacked like cordwood. Children behind barbed wire. Crematorium chimneys against gray Polish skies. Did you know? They asked. Emmy's hands trembled. She reached for her coffee cup, but could not lift it. The photographs blurred through sudden tears. She had known. Of course she had known. Everyone had known. The Reich had not hidden its intentions. It had broadcast them through loudspeakers and printed them in newspapers and celebrated them in rallies. The extermination of the Jews was not a secret. It was a promise, kept with German efficiency. But she said nothing. She could not say nothing, because words would become evidence, and evidence would become verdicts, and verdicts would become her daughter growing up with a mother behind bars. So Emmy sat in silence while the officers gathered their photographs and departed with careful notes about her non-responses. The trial at Nuremberg began in November. 22 major war criminals sat in the dock while the world watched. Hermann was among them, seated in the front row, still wearing the pale gray uniform he had designed for himself, still projecting the arrogance that had carried him from failed Austrian painter's companion to master of the Luftwaffe. Emmy followed the proceedings through newspaper accounts smuggled to her by sympathetic guards. She read how her husband laughed at the prosecution's evidence, how he cross-examined witnesses with theatrical flair, how he seemed to believe he could talk his way out of anything, even genocide. She was permitted one visit before the verdict. They brought her to Nuremberg in an American jeep, through streets still choked with rubble from Allied bombing raids that Hermann's Luftwaffe had failed to prevent. The prison was cold gray concrete. They spoke through wire mesh, guards listening to every word. Hermann looked thinner, but no less proud. He spoke of history, of how future generations would understand, of how he had only followed orders while trying to moderate the Führer's excesses. He expressed no remorse for the millions dead. He asked Emmy to preserve his legacy, to raise Edda to honor her father's memory. Emmy searched his face for something human, some flicker of guilt or grief. She found only performance. Her husband had become his own myth, and myths do not apologize. The verdict came in October 1946. Guilty on all counts, death by hanging, but Hermann cheated even that final justice. On October 15th, hours before his scheduled execution, he swallowed a cyanide capsule that had been hidden in his cell. Emmy heard the news from a guard's radio. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she walked to Edda's room, where the child was drawing pictures of mountains and flowers, and held her close. "Papa is gone," Emmy whispered. "He went away, and he cannot come back." Edda did not cry. She had learned already that crying changed nothing. She simply asked, "Are we safe now, Mama?" Emmy could not answer. Safety was a foreign country, and she no longer knew the way there. But she knew they must begin walking toward it, through whatever ruins lay ahead. The word "murderer's wife" had been painted on their door in red letters that dripped like wounds. Emmy discovered it at dawn, before Edda woke, and scrubbed it away with turpentine and rags until her hands bled. The paint came off the wood, but the stain remained, darker than the surrounding surface, a shadow that would not fade no matter how hard she worked. By the time Edda emerged for breakfast, Emmy had hung a small wreath over the mark. She told her daughter it was decoration. Another lie. The architecture of their life was built entirely on lies now. Munich in 1951 was a city of selective memory. The Americans had handed control back to German authorities. The denazification tribunals had run their course, stripping former party members of property and privileges, though many had already hidden their wealth in Swiss accounts or transferred it to sympathetic relatives. Emmy had nothing left to hide. The courts had taken everything: the jewelry, the furs, the artwork that could be traced, the bank accounts that bore Hermann's name. She worked now as a seamstress in a small shop near the Victuallian Markt, altering dresses for women who had once curtsied to her at state functions. Edda was 12 years old and learning to be invisible. Emmy had enrolled her in school under a false name, using her own maiden name of Sunman, hoping anonymity would grant her daughter something like a normal childhood. The hope lasted 3 months. A classmate's father recognized Emmy at a parent meeting and whispered the truth to his daughter. By the next morning, every child in the school knew that Edda Sunman was actually Edda Göring, daughter of the hanged Reichsmarshal. The children held their trial at recess. They formed a circle around Edda in the schoolyard, blocking her escape, demanding she confess her father's crimes. A boy named Klaus played prosecutor, reciting charges he had heard from his parents: murder of Jews, theft of art, bombing of cities. The other children chanted guilty with each accusation. A teacher finally intervened, dispersing the mob with sharp commands, but the damage was already complete. Edda walked home alone through streets that suddenly felt hostile, every face a potential accuser. That night, she confronted her mother. "Tell me everything," she demanded. "Tell me what Papa really did." Emmy sat her daughter down and spoke for 3 hours. She told of the early days, when Hermann seemed glamorous and the party seemed like Germany's salvation. She told of the gradual revelations, the whispered rumors about camps, the friends who disappeared, the questions she learned not to ask. She told of Karen Hall and its stolen treasures, of the Jewish families whose possessions hung on their walls, of the willful blindness that had allowed her to host dinner parties while millions were being murdered. She told the truth, finally, completely, because lies had failed to protect anything. Edda listened without interruption. When her mother finished, she asked only one question: "Did you love him?" Emmy could not answer for a long moment. "I loved who I thought he was," she finally said. "I do not know if that man ever existed." The years that followed taught Edda to navigate between worlds. Some Germans wanted to forget the war entirely, to bury the past beneath economic miracles and new automobiles. Others, former party members who had escaped justice, treated her with disturbing reverence, calling her the Reichsmarshal's daughter, as if it were a title of nobility. They pressed money into her hands at secret gatherings, assured her that her father had been a great man, that history would vindicate him. Etta took their money when she needed it, but she never believed their words. She had seen the photographs. She had read the trial transcripts. She knew what vindication would require, ignoring that a letter arrived from America in 1954. It bore no return address, only a New York postmark. Inside, a woman named Rachel wrote in careful German about her family. Parents taken from their apartment in Vienna, siblings lost at Auschwitz, herself surviving only because she had been sent to relatives in Brooklyn before the war began. Rachel did not accuse. She did not demand. She simply asked whether the daughter knew what the father had done. Etta wrote back. She acknowledged everything. She apologized for things she had not personally done, but felt responsible for nonetheless. She asked Rachel to tell her more, to help her understand what her family had destroyed. The correspondence continued for years, letters crossing the Atlantic like small acts of penance, building a bridge between perpetrator's child and survivor. On her 18th birthday, Etta traveled alone to Brandenburg. She found the ruins of Karen Hall overgrown with forest, birch trees pushing through shattered foundations, wildflowers blooming where chandeliers had hung. Nature was erasing her father's monument more thoroughly than any Allied bomb. She walked through the rubble until she found a fragment of marble that might have been from the Great Hall's floor. She placed a small stone atop it, not as a memorial to what had been, but as a marker for what had been destroyed to build it. Then she turned and walked back toward the road, toward a future she would have to construct entirely on her own. Emmy was dying in a Munich hospital, and Etta sat beside her bed watching the monitors trace her mother's fading heartbeat. 23 years had passed since Nuremberg. Emmy had grown old in obscurity, working menial jobs, living in small apartments, carrying guilt she could never fully articulate. The cancer had spread quickly, the doctors said. There was nothing more to be done except wait. Etta was 38 now. She worked as a medical assistant in this same hospital, using her mother's maiden name, building a life of deliberate anonymity. Most of her colleagues did not know who she was. The younger ones had never heard of Hermann Göring. The war was ancient history to them, something from their grandparents' time, fading into the same unreality as Napoleon or the Kaiser. Only the older nurses sometimes looked at Etta with recognition, with questions they were too polite to ask. Emmy's hand found her daughter's in the darkness. "The box," she whispered. "In my apartment. The locked box in the closet. After I am gone, you must decide." Etta knew the box. She had seen it throughout her childhood, a wooden chest with brass fittings that Emmy had carried from residence to residence, never opening, never explaining. She had assumed it contained mementos, photographs perhaps, or letters from happier times. She had not imagined it might contain something more dangerous. She found a box 3 days after Emmy's death. Inside were documents, photographs, correspondence, letters from Hermann written during the war years, some expressing private doubts he never showed publicly. Inventory lists of stolen artwork with annotations in Emmy's handwriting. Photographs of Emmy with Hitler, with Himmler, with men whose names were synonymous with atrocity. And journals, Emmy's own journals, describing in careful detail what she had known and when she had known it. The evidence was damning. Emmy had not been the innocent wife she claimed at Nuremberg. She had known about the stolen art from the beginning. She had helped catalog it, had corresponded with dealers in Paris and Amsterdam, had understood exactly what acquisition meant when Jewish families were involved. She had chosen complicity, and she had spent the rest of her life hiding the proof. Etta spread the documents across her kitchen table and wept. She had believed her mother's story of ignorance, had built her understanding of the past on Emmy's carefully constructed narrative. Now that narrative crumbled like the walls of Karen Hall, revealing something uglier beneath that a week later, an Israeli historian named Dr. Yosef Tal contacted her. He had spent decades documenting Nazi art theft, tracing stolen masterpieces through auction houses and private collections. He knew Emmy had kept records. He asked, very gently, whether Etta might consider sharing them for his research. He promised discretion. He promised context. He promised that truth, however painful, served memory better than silence. They met at a cafe near the English Garden. Dr. Tao was 70 years old, with numbers tattooed on his left forearm that he did not hide. He had survived Auschwitz. His entire family had not. He had spent his life ensuring that what happened to them would not be forgotten or denied. Etta expected accusation. Instead, she found understanding. Dr. Tao did not blame her for her father's crimes or her mother's complicity. He spoke of inherited guilt as a burden, not a sentence. He told her that children were not responsible for their parents' choices, but they could choose how to respond to the knowledge of those choices. She gave him the box. The book Dr. Tao published 3 years later laid bare the full scope of Nazi art theft, including Emmy's role in facilitating it. Etta's name appeared in the acknowledgments, thanked for her courage in choosing truth over legacy. Some readers condemned her for betraying her mother. Others praised her for the same act. Etta found she did not care about either response. She had done what she believed was right. The judgment of strangers could not add to or subtract from that certainty. A final letter arrived from New York that winter. Rachel, her correspondent of 20 years, was also dying. Her letter was brief but luminous. She wrote that she had forgiven Hermann Göring, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because hatred had grown too heavy to carry through a lifetime. She hoped Etta could forgive herself for the accident of her birth, for the crime of being loved by a monster. Etta read the letter on a bench in the English Garden, surrounded by children playing and couples walking hand in hand, ordinary life proceeding as if the past were truly past. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket. Then she sat for a long while, watching the light change over Munich, this city that had been the birthplace of National Socialism and was now just another European capital, rebuilding and forgetting and remembering in cycles. She would never escape her father's shadow entirely. There would always be someone who recognized the name, who connected her to the crimes, who looked at her with suspicion or twisted admiration. But she had learned to carry the weight. She had learned that guilt could be transformed, not erased, into something resembling responsibility. She had learned that the past was not a prison, only an inheritance, and inheritances could be spent in many ways. She stood, smoothed her coat, and walked home through the autumn streets. The story of the Göring family would never truly end. But Etta had written her own chapter, and it was one she could bear to read.